Hello again, YouTube. It's Peter back with you at long last. And recently I was doing my thing, sitting around painting miniatures, listening to podcasts. And I was listening to a podcast called Straight White American Jesus. Check it out sometime if you want. Now, in this podcast, the host of the podcast was posing a question to his guest at the time, Dr. Andrew Whitehead. And he asks him about the relationship between Christian nationalism and conspiracy theories. And I had one of those moments where like the dutiful student in class goes, "Ooh, I know the answer." But then the guest on the podcast, Dr. Whitehead, he starts going off in a direction that, well, not necessarily wrong. It seemed very abstract and high level. Here, let me play clips.
Why are white Christian nationalists and white evangelicals so susceptible to conspiracy? What is that? What is baked in there that connects them? And so, wondering how that all looks from your perspective.
So that's the question. And again, I was in my mind, had my own set of answers queued up. And then the response was something like this.
Yeah. Well, I think, broadly some other work that Sam and I have done with Joseph Baker, where we're looking at sources of authority, right? And how Americans who embrace Christian nationalism think about authority. And we're kind of comparing, science and the institution of science compared to the Bible, right? And this idea of the Bible as the final authority.
Okay, and this goes on for almost 4 minutes, and it felt kind of meandering. And I felt somewhat let down in that moment because I feel that there is a much more straightforward explanation for the relationship between things like Christian nationalism, although I'm not necessarily going to use that label in the situation. I'll get back to that. And conspiracy theories. So I know that people love to quibble about labels. Christian nationalist, white Christian nationalist, evangelical, quibbling over denominations and who does and does not fit this description. So instead, imagine a circle, and this circle represents the 2 billion Christians, roughly, in the world. And then imagine a smaller circle, significantly smaller, but still noteworthy, particularly in the United States, of tens of millions of Christians who were taught certain things. The labels aren't important. It's more the ideas that they were taught. And we can quibble over which denomination, what label, that's not important. Just the big circle is all of Christianity, and then within that circle is a much smaller but significant circle encompassing tens of millions of people. So why are Christian nationalists, or however you want to label them, so susceptible to conspiracy theories? The much more direct answer is that through certain teachings, such as end times prophecy teachings and the satanic panic, that conspiracy theories and certain types of Christian teaching are interwoven. So take, for example, the whole end times revelation, end times prophecy that certain preachers and certain denominations within particularly American Protestantism love to play on, because merely sinking in the hooks of shame and guilt over regular sin, that doesn't necessarily have the urgency of saying, oh no, the end is coming soon. And now, obviously, within Christianity, the idea that the end is nigh goes all the way back to Jesus when he told some of his followers that some of them standing there would live to see the end. Not so much. Then, Paul, of course, in his letters, you can see that he was teaching that the end was imminent, and then suddenly people say, yo, Paul, well, some of our loved ones have started to die, and you said the end was supposed to happen like any day now. What's with that? And then you see, Paul trying to backpedal, and that's actually where the idea of the rapture comes from, is Paul's attempt to explain away the fact that the imminent end of the world turns out not to be so imminent. And then, 2,000 years goes by, and you have various beliefs in the end of the world, certain times and places where it flares up. But within the last 200 years, and particularly within America, and to a lesser extent the UK, it's kind of become a big idea, particularly in what was called the Second Great Awakening, in roughly the 1820s to 1850s-ish. I don't know the exact dates off the top of my head. That's what things like Google and Wikipedia are for, right? So in 1844, a man named William Miller convinced a bunch of people that the end was going to come on October 22nd, 1844. A lot of people sold or gave away all their worldly possessions, waited for it to happen, and oh boy, it didn't. And in case spoiler alert, the world did not end on October 22nd, 1844. But various movements spun off from that, including the Seventh-day Adventists, who a spin-off from that ended up being the Waco Branch Davidians. You have other groups like the Jehovah's Witnesses that have had numerous failed prophecies. You have people like Harold Camping that only about 12 years ago or so, he was predicting the end of the world. But then you have the Cold War, and obviously when the actual annihilation of mankind is technologically possible, and there's a broad spread social anxiety over this, it's much more easy to peddle end times prophecy. But if you're simply going by the content of the book of Revelations or various passages in the Bible, you're more likely to start looking up what plants grow on the island of Patmos, rather than saying, oh, clearly the signs are all there, because the signs are all vague. So, as you get people like Hal Lindsey, who are writing books like The Late Great Planet Earth, which was one of the best-selling nonfiction books of the 70s and 80s, spouting end times biblical prophecy, they have to take what are basically highly symbolic fever dream imaginings of things like the Book of Revelations. They need to put some meat on the bones of what otherwise would seem like a hallucinogenic fever dream. And that's where they start to incorporate not only real-world events and things like the Soviet Union, but also incorporating ideas that really come from right-wing conspiratorial style thinking. Like the John Birch Society, the idea that there's some sinister cabal of people who are going to create a new world order. And Hal Lindsey, not only did he write The Late Great Planet Earth, but he was one of the writers of the Left Behind series. So you have, for several generations, tens of millions of Christians who were taught that the end of the world is imminent. And that in order to make this seem plausible, and again, just not like the hallucinogenic, highly symbolic fever dream that is the Book of Revelations and other so-called prophecies within the Bible, they have to incorporate real-world events and nations and ideas. In order to point beyond those events, they need essentially a conspiratorial narrative. So you get to things like the Left Behind series. Now, this was the sort of book series that 10, 15 years ago, you could have gone into any used bookstore, charity shop, and found dozens of copies of the various Left Behind books. And there was all sorts of movies, and even a video game based on these, where, of course, you get to slaughter the unrighteous heathens. Now, these books and the fleshing out of the Book of Revelations and other biblical prophecies with real-world politics was massively popular and influential to tens of millions of Christians, and including some secular people as well. And it basically had ideas like that the United Nations was going to create some one-world government, and that the European Union, in spite of the clown show that it seems to be, would somehow get its shit together, and that would give rise to a Eurotrash Antichrist, who, of course, in the books they call Nicholas Carpathia, right? Like, it reminds me of the guy from the Ghostbusters 2, the main villain from that. Yeah, they got to give him some ridiculous villain name, but that didn't stop other doomsday prophets and people attributing, claiming that they understand the Book of Revelations, for pointing to various people like Saddam Hussein or Barack Obama. There's always different candidates for who the Antichrist is supposed to be. So not only are they taking from current events, but these events are supposed to be going somewhere. There's supposed to be the rise of an Antichrist at the head of a one-world government who will persecute Christians and force people to take the mark of the beast. This is all a part of the common story of modern Christian eschatology. So when you have things like hesitancy towards taking the vaccine, Why would that shock anyone? You have people who, tens of millions of people, who have been told that everyone is going to be forced to take the mark of the beast. And of course, what the mark of the beast is supposed to be has changed over time, just like who the Antichrist is supposed to be has changed over time. So at one point, the mark of the beast was things like barcodes. And once you get ideas like microchips, and then, oh, they're going to put a microchip inside the vaccine, it was, in a sense, inevitable. The fact that anyone would be surprised that there would be at least some percentage of the population too paranoid to take this because they believe they already know through biblical prophecy where the world is heading, and they know that there's a group of sinister forces that have an agenda to create a one world government, to give rise to the Antichrist, to persecute Christians. They know that all of these things are going to happen. So of course they're going to look at something like the vaccine, which nearly everyone was, if not required to take, then strongly encouraged to take at the very least. Of course they're going to look at it through that paranoid lens, directly influenced by the ideas put forward within modern Protestant, predominantly Protestant evangelical Christianity. Again, this is what sort of surprised me about this response by Dr. Whitehead, is it's about their concept of authority. Like, no, they have much more concrete, point directly to it ideas that you can say, okay, they already have this mentality about how the world is supposed to play out. Of course they're going to interpret everything through this lens that they've been taught to interpret all current events through and all political events through. The only thing is, if you're shocked by that, I wonder, like, have you ever met these people? Why would you be shocked by it? The second major piece that directly explains how Christian nationalists could be susceptible to conspiracy theories is the anti-intellectualism and anti-science ideas of creationism. Now, the thing about creationism is that when you are promoting a scientifically untenable point of view, that which is to deny reality, you have to undermine the authority of the other point of view. Now, this is where I think that there is plenty of merit to what Dr. Whitehead is saying. The problem is that his answer, his 3.5-minute answer roughly, was very indirect and just didn't, name names and call out specific ideas that are common as grass amongst many of these types of Christians. So when you teach people that science is deliberately lying about things like evolution, about the age of the earth and of the universe, and that this is all some sort of grand conspiracy to deny the truth of creationism, and that these are just other stories or ideas not supported by evidence. If you can keep your believers ignorant of why science believes what it believes about things like evolution and the age of the earth and the age of the universe, and instead just put them on an equal level of these are stories, but that's their story, and they're deliberately lying to you, trust us because we have the infallible truth of the Bible, that sort of thing, that opens the door to denial of science in general, or picking and choosing what parts of science they want to believe. So if they can see some sort of tangible thing from it, like technology, they're not going to deny it, as Dr. Whitehead pointed out in his answer. But if it contradicts their worldview, then I guess science must be engaged in some elaborate conspiracy to deny the truth of creationism and foist their own creation myth of evolution and the Big Bang on people. It's not as if there's scientific evidence for those things. Just believe in us. Don't believe them. Believe us. But if you can get them to ignore the actual evidence for evolution or the Big Bang or the age of the earth and present them as merely stories that these nefarious scientists are trying to push, then you can extend that to climate change and to vaccines and on, because after all, you've already laid down the keystone idea that you don't actually have to trust science as a process or scientists, that scientists can act as a shadowy cabal trying to get you to believe things that aren't true. Tens of millions of Christians in the United States operate within what amounts to a fairly closed information system in which they are only supposed to listen to Christian music and read Christian books and go to church and talk to only other people like them. Even before the modern age of Facebook algorithms and 24-hour news with a particular bias to it, there was a deliberate attempt to create a sheltered, contained world by dividing certain Christians from the so-called secular world. They were supposed to operate entirely within the subculture of Christianity, with its own movies, music, video games, books, you name it, an entire parallel culture that they are supposed to operate within. And as for the rest of the culture, they're taught some rather straw man ideas that they have absolute truth, but the secular world only believes in relativism and doesn't believe in absolute truth, and that everything is corrupt and decadent. This Declensian worldview that the whole world is going to hell in a handbasket is not only part and parcel of the idea of being separate from the rest of the world, but it goes back to these view of we're now living in the end times. If you want to promote the idea that the end is nigh, you have to convince people that the world is getting worse and worse and worse, and you, the so-called elect, you have to be separate from the rest of the world. And this sort of intellectual and cultural separatism, not only does it make them awkward, stilted people who can't relate to the rest of society and wonder why the rest of the society kind of treats them very often as somewhere between a laughing stock and offensive and out of touch with everyone else, because they are by design, but also it breeds an anti-intellectual attitude for any ideas or information outside of the Christian evangelical subculture, because that's all you're supposed to read, talk about, think about, listen to. And scholars of religion have been pondering why there's been such a decline in religiosity in the last 20 years. And I would say that the number one change to our society, the biggest, most noticeable, most impactful change, is the internet. So you should probably start there. And given what I just said about the information bubble that certain types of Christians, particularly evangelical Protestants typically, want their adherents to stay within, something that punctures their bubble and starts to bring in other points of view that break down their fundamentalist biblical literalism, is of course going to act like the dam breaking, because now there's information that would not have been easily accessible before that is starting to change people's views and attitudes. And remember that fundamentalism as a movement was astroturfed by an oil baron who explicitly wanted to counteract the type of social gospel liberal Christianity and any kind of Christianity that smacked of following the words of Jesus but also being left-wing, because fundamentalism was set up as a counterweight to liberal social gospel Christianity. It was promoted by the more business class minded of American society. It was explicitly anti-modern, explicitly anti-intellectual. It took the biblical criticism of the time, higher criticism. It took evolution and other scientific developments and just said nope, and doubled down on biblical literalism, which within the grand scheme of Christianity, biblical literalism is actually a pretty unusual idea. We just assume that every Christian throughout history has always literally believed the Bible. That's not nearly as true as you would imagine. Biblical literalism, rather than being the default state that Christianity has always held until modern times, is a specific rejection and doubling down against modernity and against, of all things, biblical scholarship, which by the late 19th century was already starting to profoundly challenge ideas like biblical literalism and inerrancy. Another way in which conspiracy theories like the QAnon conspiracy and Christian nationalism became interwoven was through the satanic panic, in which these ideas that there were cabals of Satanists running around, abducting and causing harm to children, these ideas were in many cases mainstreamed by the media, by talk shows, by books, popular entertainment, and it was all taken very seriously, not only by the mainstream media, but by middle America. And there is a direct continuum from the QAnon ideas about children being transported in pieces of furniture or being held underneath a pizza parlor, in the basement of a pizza parlor that doesn't even have a basement, to the sort of ideas of the satanic panic of the 1980s. and into the 90s. What's changed is that they become slightly more specific. So now it's the Democratic Party and certain wealthy and powerful elites, whereas during the Satanic Panic, it was, the daycare worker, the dentist, people you might know in your day-to-day life. The targets have moved, but the ideas about rituals, harming children, all these sorts of things are more or less exactly the same. And so given what I've just said, I was honestly taken aback by this answer by Dr. Whitehead that was basically looking for psychological explanations, in approaching things at a very high level while not entirely invalid. It's just missing some really obvious and direct things, like the way in which modern Christian eschatology borrows from and aligns with and parallels conspiratorial thinking about cabals running the world, driving things towards a new world government, the apocalyptic future, the way that their anti-intellectualism feeds into science denial, beliefs about things like the mark of the beast. It's actually really easy to understand why these sorts of people would be more prone to conspiracy theories, because it's kind of already baked into their worldview. It's not from the Bible directly, but this is, again, a mistake that I've seen recently in other things where I've been watching or listening to podcasts or various things about Christian nationalism, where I hear someone who had a falling out with their church because they don't see it as aligning with the Jesus they read in the Bible. But you didn't join the Jesus of the Bible church. You joined the 21st century American insert denomination church here that has very specific ideas, a very specific history, political alignments and allegiances, and commitments to ideas that extend before they were born. Much of modern Christianity is what you would call metatextual. You are not going to understand Christianity in modern America by merely reading the Bible. You have to understand all of the surrounding ideas. And many of these surrounding ideas, as I've just explained, are interwoven with conspiratorial ideas, both responding to and incorporating, but also creating conspiratorial ideas. And Christian nationalism as a whole is essentially taking the idea of American exceptionalism and interweaving it with the Bible. So when a preacher like Jerry Falwell says that America is being punished with hurricanes because of the debauchery that happens in New Orleans, he is directly referencing biblical ideas about Israel's covenant with God, but then superimposing those on modern America. Christian nationalists are susceptible to conspiracy theories not merely because of their psychology or their attitudes towards authority, but because many of these conspiratorial ideas already dovetailed perfectly with ideas they were taught within their Christian milieu. Ideas about the end of the world, ideas about satanic cabals being everywhere, harming children, ideas about the mark of the beast. They were taught to have an anti-science, anti-intellectual worldview because at some level the people teaching them those ideas understood that outside ideas were dangerous to their biblical literalism and their narrow worldview. If people started to understand that, yes, science actually does have good reasons to believe in evolution and the ancient age of the earth and the Big Bang, and if biblical scholarship really starts to tear down their literalist view of the Bible, then how will they maintain control over their flock if suddenly these outside ideas start to poke holes in their closed worldview? So anti-science, anti-intellectualism started to become part of the control mechanism that they would exert on their flocks. In giving believers a sense of mission that the end of the world is imminent or that they have to take America back for God is a way to incentivize them on the hamster wheel of their belief. They have to give them something to focus on that seems tangible to them. They have to fight for America. They have to prepare for the end, etc. That sense of urgency, it can drive them on, whereas merely the you're a sinner, get right with God, shame and guilt cycle isn't going to have the same propulsion as telling them that there is these urgent things that must be done right now. And this sense of urgency primes them to look at the world through a certain lens where they're confirming what they already believe, finding pieces of the news that fit. Oh, there's a war, you see, and then they said there would be wars and rumors of wars. It's just like the prophecy said. Oh, this is all part of how the Illuminati one world government will come to power. Protestant American evangelical eschatology is not some radically different set of ideas from conspiracy theories. They're more like siblings, or at most cousins. And so you don't have to go into elaborate explanations about their attitudes towards authority to explain how they can step from one to the other, because there's not some giant chasm between them. They're already adjacent. They just step from one to the other shockingly easily. Now, I could go on elaborating and expanding on these points, but I'm going to leave it here because my overall point was that I think there is a much more direct way to explain how Christian nationalists can believe in conspiracy theories than appealing to their attitudes toward authority or some just high-level psychological things like that. They already believe in related things. Anyway, that's all I have to say for right now. Have a good whatever time it is.